The Samiverse, by S.M. Thompson. A story inspired by the Bobbyverse series of books by Dennis E. Taylor. Chapter 1. The Vortex. One of the many perks of living in Las Vegas was that there's always something to do. To most people, that means binge drinking from comically oversized plastic cups and proceeding to throw hard-earned money straight into the pockets of billionaire casino owners. But the city that never sleeps did occasionally provide opportunities for more cerebral forms of entertainment. As I entered the convention center floor, I was greeted by all the usual sights and smells. Virtually every science fiction character in existence could be found somewhere in this room, and as with most conventions of this type, an uncomfortable percentage of those in costume seemed to be unacquainted with the modern marvel known as deodorant. Doing my best to acclimate to the odor, I looked up to see squadrons of stormtroopers walking peacefully among roving packs of Jedi Knights. Starfleet crews were seen taking selfies with the occasional rogue Borg. Hell, I half expected to turn around and see a xenomorph and a predator high-fiving. It was like I'd walked into nerd nirvana. While I was never the cosplayer type myself, I had been obsessed with science fiction for as long as I could remember, so I could still appreciate the efforts of those who did choose to come in character. Some of my earliest memories were of my family gathered around the TV set watching Star Trek TNG reruns, so it only made sense that I turned out to be a huge science nerd as an adult. The Vortex SF convention had become one of my favorite annual activities since moving to Las Vegas for graduate school 4 years ago. While most people come to Vegas to engage in the typical assortment of debauchery this town was so famous for offering, I actually moved here to learn. And no, not to learn how to count cards. I moved here to study one thing: rocks. Yes, rocks. For anyone willing to skip the yard-long margaritas and make a short drive outside America's favorite money pit, this corner of the world offered up a truly phenomenal selection of geologic points of interest. To the untrained eye, your typical rock is no more interesting than the dirt it likely was picked up from. Unimportant, unremarkable, and let's face it, a bit boring. However, one thing I realized very early on as a student of geology was that every rock tells a story. For the lucky few of us who learn how to read that story, the earth begins to casually reveal its deepest secrets in each boulder, pebble, and grain of sand. While driving through the winding desert roads outside Las Vegas, a person will find themselves surrounded by towering walls of rock, forming miniature canyons. To most people, the only remarkable thing about these outcrops would be the shade from the harsh Nevada sun they occasionally provided. However, to a geologist like myself, each of these road cuts served as a floor-to-ceiling window into our planet's enigmatic past. Out here, one could easily find rocks ranging in age from a few thousand years old to a few billion years old, and the knowledge of that fact had undoubtedly played a big part in my choice to accept the offer into the Earth System Science PhD program at Sin City University. As with most people in their final year of a PhD program, I didn't exactly have a lot of spare time. So when I did get a chance to get out of the lab, I tended to pounce on it like my cats did to essentially anything besides the overpriced cat toys I bought them. While my sometimes seemingly endless workload as a research assistant had prevented me from attending the first day of the convention, I made sure to arrive as early as possible for day 2, determined to make up for the lost time. I looked beyond the meandering horde of my fellow nerds to find a schedule board for today's panels and Q&As. Across the room, I saw a pack of Wookiees disband after taking a group photo to reveal the schedule board I was looking for. As I made my way to the board, a hand holding a flashy brochure reached out and blocked my path. I looked up to find that the hand was attached to a young man, probably early 20s, wearing a finely tailored suit and sporting the grin I can only compare to that of a used car salesman. "Good afternoon, sir," said the booth worker in an unnaturally chipper tone. "Do you have a few moments to learn about the future of cryonics?" While my response in this situation would typically be to quickly say, "No thanks," and scurry away as fast as possible, his casual use of the word cryonics had admittedly piqued my interest. "Give me just a few moments of your time, and you could win one of many great prizes as a part of this year's company raffle," he said, while gesturing to a nearby folding table littered with corporately branded swag, ranging from beer koozies to pens to entire iPads and everything in between. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was never one to pass on an offer for free convention swag, so if he didn't have my attention before with the whole cryonics thing, he certainly had it now. It was only then that I read the logo carefully placed on each item in the proverbial pile of booty laid out before me. Cryo Eterna. The name was familiar. They were a small startup based here in Vegas, or at least they had been. As I recalled, the company was founded only a few years before I had moved to the city, however. In the 4 grueling years I'd so far spent working to complete my PhD, the company had exploded in growth. While smaller cryonics companies were already scattered across the country, Cryo Eterna was able to find a relative niche in an already niche market. If I remember correctly, their first major client was breakout Saturday Night Live star Pete Davidson, who I can only imagine made the commitment after one hell of a bender on the Las Vegas Strip. The company quickly went viral with the youths after the media caught wind of the story, and their popularity kind of just snowballed from there. While the company's early success could be attributed to catering to the rich and famous, emphasis on famous, within a few years of opening, their clientele suddenly shifted away from the Pete Davidsons and Kevin Hart's dogs of the world to the young millionaires and billionaires out of Silicon Valley looking to gamble their unfound wealth on a chance at cheating death. Eventually, the company was bought out by some Wall Street hedge fund for an amount of money that thinking about alone made me cringe. So needless to say, the startup had grown up a bit since its humble beginning just a few years ago. "Sure, I've got a few minutes to spare," I said in a calm tone, trying to hide my lust for free stuff. I knew I could never afford the service this kid was about to try to sell me, but I could afford to stand here for 5 minutes if it meant a new beverage insulation apparatus in my near future. He smiled and began his obviously pre-rehearsed speech. "I'm a representative of Cryo Eterna, the world leader in cryopreservation technology. Our services are at the forefront of this fascinating journey into the future. By entrusting our company with the preservation of your biological material, you're investing in a future where medical breakthroughs could pave the way for renewed life. It's a choice that transcends the boundaries of conventional thinking and embraces the limitless possibilities of science." The sales creature continued with his speech on the benefits of cryopreservation, while simultaneously presenting accompanying graphics on his tablet, explaining the whole process from start to finish. "We offer many different packages to accommodate the final wishes of all our customers. While our most popular option is our Gold membership package, I'm glad to announce a new reduced rate for our Deluxe Platinum membership," he said in his uncanny customer service voice. He looked at me, seemingly waiting for a response. "So what's the difference?" I said, trying my best to sound as unsarcastic as possible. He perked up again and continued his pitch. "Through a simple and painless procedure following the cessation of vital functions, we're able to offer our Gold-level clients the dedicated preservation of their synaptic tissue." I stifled a chuckle. "The Walt Disney special," I thought to myself while trying to keep my composure, unable to stop myself from what I said next. "So let me get this straight. Rich people pay you to cut off their heads?" I asked with my eyes wide. "I take it you don't get a lot of French customers, huh?" The booth worker looked at me with complete confusion. Without skipping a beat, he continued with his people popsicle corporate propaganda, as I realized my joke had just sailed straight over his $100 haircut. "While full body preservation is available for our platinum level clients, the Gold package still provides many of the same potential benefits. We're also happy to offer the attendance of the Vortex, such as yourself a special 10% off discount, with Gold packages starting as low as $72,000. $72,000, and that was with the special discount? If the lower tier package cost this much, how much did the Platinum membership cost? Needless to say, I wasn't signing up for anything today, not on the measly stipend the university paid me. Chalk it up to morbid curiosity, but I found myself asking the booth worker about the price of the Platinum membership, knowing good and well that just hearing the amount spoken alone would probably leave me nauseous. "So how much is the Platinum package?" I said, trying to conceal my internal disgust with his previous statement. "Our Platinum memberships now start as low as $250,000, however, with additional services," he continued talking, but my brain tuned out after I heard the number. Suddenly, it made sense why a cryonics company was soliciting in a sci-fi convention. They were here hoping to catch the eyes of a few well-endowed nerds and sell them a ticket to the world of tomorrow. I wondered if anyone here at the Vortex could actually afford to be a client of Cryo Eterna. I mean, it's not exactly a challenge to sell a sci-fi nerd on the whole cryopreservation thing, but I imagine the hard part is finding one that can actually pay for it. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that one of these Vulcans or Ewoks running around were just one bad car crash or heart attack away from joining a recently thawed pizza delivery boy and a drunk robot in New York. I took this as a natural opening to bring the conversation to an end. Well, while I admit I find the whole idea of cryopreservation intriguing, I will almost certainly never be able to afford your services, so I better let you get to finding a real customer. I moved to take a step forward, but was immediately met with more enthusiasm. Don't be so sure, he said with all the vigor of a bad daytime game show host. He pointed to the end of the raffle prize table, where a small silver card sat inconspicuously. By taking the time to hear me out today, you've been entered into a chance to win a prepaid Cryo Eterna Platinum package, said the booth worker. I had been too busy ogling over free beer holsters to notice the real prize on the table. All I need from you is your contact info, he said, presenting a pen and clipboard. While I knew that providing my info would most definitely result in some additional spam in my inbox, I figured that was a small price to pay for a shot at life after death. I took the clipboard and scribbled down my info without hesitation. I immediately noticed that the clipboard was already full of random names and emails. Each page held easily 40, 50 names, and I was writing on just one of a dozen already full pages. Apparently, the Cryo Eterna booth had garnered a lot of attention from curious geeks like myself yesterday. Perhaps this raffle would be harder than I thought. He took the clipboard back while trying to read my name as casually as possible. Thank you for your time. Mr. Scott, please feel free to keep that pen. It's got all of our contact info on it in case you ever do want to enlist our services. Yay! Free stuff! I happily pocketed the pen, knowing full well that I would never call the number so carefully engraved into the side of my new writing utensil. But I gave him a grin, shook his hand, and went on my merry way. As I again started my march toward the panel schedule, the voice of the sales rep rang out behind me. The winners will be announced at the end of today's panels. Enjoy the rest of the convention, and good luck, he said. I turned my head back toward him, gave him a little courteous head nod, and continued walking. Had I just wasted 5 minutes of precious con time? Probably. Was I going to win the Cryo Eterna Platinum package? Probably not, but hey, I could always use another beer koozie. I finally arrived at the schedule board, which concisely presented the 3-day convention's wide array of panels and talks. I read through the titles of what I'd missed on the previous day. Thankfully, it looked like I hadn't missed too much of the good stuff. However, there was one talk in particular I was already salty about missing. Exploring the galaxy, the technological and economic prerequisites to get interstellar probes into space must have been an absolutely incredible panel. I had been reading the work of the panel's main speaker, Lawrence Vienne, for years now, as had a likely majority of folks attending this convention. He was not only one of the most prolific science fiction authors of our generation, Vienne also held PhDs in both electrical engineering and astrophysics. His background as a scientist gave him the uncanny ability to ride the line between hard science and science fiction in his many best-selling books, which was undoubtedly a major source of his success as an author. While I was disappointed that I'd missed the chance to attend the panel in person, I knew that someone had most likely recorded the talk and put it online. I made a mental note to track down a video of the panel when I got home later that night, and to pick up a sandwich from Capriotti's on the way home to pair with this newfound evening entertainment. After spending a few minutes on my phone placing an order for my favorite sandwich, I realized my ADD was showing, and I was again wasting valuable con time. I caught the attention of the nearest Klingon and asked for directions to the closest Trek-themed anything. He seemingly lit up at the human contact, whipped out a near-perfect replica of a TNG tricorder, and proceeded to gleefully offer directions to its source. The rest of the day was spent bouncing between different booths and panels, and I eventually found myself in the last panel of the day. It was a talk by Dr. Myrta Anders on the recent advances in artificial intelligence. As a person with only a minor level of knowledge on coding and computer engineering, a lot of the more technical talk went right over my head. However, there were still a lot of interesting points being made. AI research had come far since the time of IBM's Watson, but as the speaker pointed out during her talk, it still had a long way to go. Dr. Anders specifically emphasized the often overlooked value of neurological research in advancing modern AI systems. "The human brain is nothing more than a biological computer," said the speaker. "If we ever hope to create true AI, an AI which is indistinguishable from a living human, we must continue studies of the brain. While it's true the human brain is limited in its capacity for growth and adaptation, a highly detailed scan of the brain's neural pathways could serve as the template on which we can build a true AI. Using the brain to build a human-based AI? The concept was intriguing but sounded more like science fiction than actual science. The logic of it made sense. Use the human brain as a source code of sorts to build a sentient AI. Sounds great, right? However, capturing a detailed scan of the brain's individual neural pathways was a lot easier said than done. I mean, perhaps the folks of the 22nd century would find a way to crack the problem, but I had little hope that us stuck here in the 21st century would ever see the solution come to light. Then again, perhaps I'd be revived by another corporate drone from Cryo Eterna in the 22nd century and eat my words. Yeah, right. Dr. Anders made her concluding remarks, and the moderator of the panel made his way to the podium. "What an incredible talk by Dr. Anders," said the moderator with a sincere grin sprawling across his face. "Thank you for taking time away from your research to come share your expertise. Just promise me you won't name your AI Hal, okay?" The crowd chuckled in unison at the moderator's cheap joke. "Now, unfortunately, we've gone a bit over on our time, so there will be no time for the Q&A portion of the panel." Again in unison, the crowd let out a boo, with the loudest boos coming from those who were already standing in line for questions. I know," said the moderator, trying to calm the crowd. Most of the crowd had seemingly booed in jest more than anything else, but there were definitely a few people who seemed genuinely upset by the situation. Apparently, this topic was of keen interest to more than a few audience members. Now, to conclude another successful day of the Vortex, I'd like to welcome our newest sponsor, Cryo Eterna, to the stage for a brief presentation on the future of cryonics and the results of their incredibly generous raffle, said the moderator. There were murmurs among the crowd. Some folks stifled a laugh at the announcement, some voiced their hopes for winning the raffle to their friends, and others continued to vocalize their disappointment in the lack of a Q&A for the previous talk. I sat in silence, waiting patiently to receive my free swag. I wondered what type of beer I would christen my new Cryo Eterna branded koozie with when I got home. A Cryo Eterna rep walked up to the podium and began to speak. This wasn't the same rep that I'd spoken to at their booth earlier, but the two did share an uncanny resemblance to one another. He rattled off roughly the same spiel I'd received earlier. In closing, I just want to thank each and every one of you who made the time to stop by our booth this week. We know that cryopreservation seems like science fiction, but with the hard work of our researchers and the open minds of those attending the Vortex, we here at Cryo Eterna are turning science fiction into science fact. Open minds and open wallets, I thought to myself as the crowd clapped around me. Our raffle today includes many wonderful items, but only one lucky sci-fi fan will be taking home the big prize, a prepaid lifetime membership to the Cryo Eterna Platinum package. Firstly, the winners of the Cryo Eterna beer koozies have just been emailed. Please stop by the Cryo Eterna booth on your way out to claim your prize. The room was suddenly aglow with the light of hundreds of smartphone screens, each attendant frantically checking their email, myself included. As I refreshed my inbox for the 5th time in as many seconds, I heard the disembodied sounds of celebration from around the room. By the sound of it, about 20-30 people had won a koozie, and apparently I was not one of them. Shit, I said under my breath. Now where would I put my beers? The speaker gave the room a few more moments to check their emails before continuing. Next up, we have the tablets, said the speaker while holding a shiny new iPad as the crowd oohed and ahed accordingly. Personally, I wasn't a big fan of Apple products, but hey, free iPad. The speaker produced a small glass jar from beneath the podium, seemingly filled to the brim with fortune cookie-sized scraps of paper. He reached a hand into the jar and began to pick out the names of the winners. The winners are Tyler Williams, Donald Gill, and finally, Sam, I sat on the edge of my seat waiting in anticipation. "Sam's son, Swenson!" 3 people in the crowd shot straight up, presumably being Tyler, Donald, and Samson. He really had me going there for a second. The speaker congratulated the winners and again directed them to visit the Cryo Eterna booth to redeem their prizes. No koozie, no iPad, and no realistic chance I was going to win the grand prize, right? I remembered the bulky clipboard I'd signed at the booth this morning. It easily had 500 names already on it, probably more, and that was this morning. As a reminder, the winner of this final drawing will receive membership to the Cryo Eterna Platinum package. This package includes full body preservation upon death, and the establishment of a trust in the winner's name to secure the continued cryopreservation of their remains for a guaranteed minimum of 100 years, he said, as the crowd erupted with cheers. Apparently, the potential of winning a free ticket to the future was enough to win over a crowd of sci-fi nerds. Who would have guessed? I eyed the nearest exit and began to formulate my escape plan. Once the winner was announced, there would undoubtedly be some additional cheers, immediately followed by a stampede-like movement of the crowd to the exits and the bathrooms. I reached down to collect my bags of miscellaneous and overpriced memorabilia from which I was already beginning to feel buyer's remorse, when the Cryo Eterna rep reached into the jar and pulled out a strip of paper. "And the winner of our Cryo Eterna Platinum membership is Mr. Samuel Scott." The crowd remained silent as the speaker swept his gaze across the room. "Mr. Scott, if you're here, could you please stand up for us?" said the speaker. The bags dropped from my hands as I began to gradually rise out of my seat. The crowd again let out a wild cacophony of cheers and swears. As the realization of what had just happened starting to slowly creep into my brain, I looked down at the blue pen sitting neatly in my shirt's breast pocket. I guess I would be needing that contact info after all. Chapter 2. The Valley of Death. You'd be surprised how little your life changes after winning the lottery. At least that's the case when your lottery's only windfall is the promise that a stranger would appear from the shadows upon your death to take temporary ownership of your lifeless body and proceed to shove it into a glorified freezer. To give Cryo Eterna some credit, the process was a bit more involved than loading slabs of meat into a cold storage locker. Following the conclusion of the raffle at the Vortex, I was almost immediately whisked away in a black luxury SUV by the Cryo Eterna spokesman and his gaggle of doting interns, booth guy included. Given that I wasn't actually paying for anything, the whole process was about as easy as signing divorce papers, or so I imagined, having never been married or subsequently divorced. A few signatures here, a dozen initials there, a thorough discussion on the division of assets, and within less than an hour I was done with the paperwork and spit back out onto the Las Vegas Strip. Just like that, the newest platinum-level client of Cryo Eterna was out on the streets, walking among the common rabble. I began the short walk back to the convention center, and my car, as a sort of comfortable numbness toward the outcome of today's events, began to set in. The sales rep had offered me a ride back after wrapping up the paperwork, but for some reason I opted for the reflective stroll past drunk people and panhandlers option instead. Also, Capriati's was along the route, and the sandwich I had so carefully ordered earlier that morning had a set pickup time that was now long past due. I picked up my slightly soggy sandwich, arrived back to my beat-up car, and began the drive back to my cozy one-bedroom apartment across from campus. Upon arrival, I was greeted by the small herd of cats I had collected in my spare time since moving to Las Vegas just a few years ago. Ricky, Julian, and Bubbles bombarded me with a harmony of vocalizations so clearly meant to convey a singular message. Dinner service was late, and amends must be made. I fed and watered the cats accordingly, and it was finally time to feed the only remaining animal in the household. It was only after carefully plating up my sandwich and conducting the small miracle that was perfectly pouring a pint of Guinness from a can into a chilled pint glass that the gravity of today's events hit my brain like an asteroid about to ruin the day of some big lizards. Following a series of minor panic attacks, some light snacking, and a whole lot of cat petting for dopamine later, I had started to come to terms with my new destiny, or rather the destiny of my remains. Shortly after the whole Cryo Eterna thing, my life quickly returned to normal. Normal, meaning the cloud of organized chaos that is the life of a person preparing to defend their PhD dissertation. To make a long story short, I soon came out the other side with a new honorific attached to my name. After dedicating over a decade of my life to the pursuit of knowledge, I was officially a rock doc. It had been a little over 7 years since that fateful day in a sweaty Las Vegas convention center, and not much in my life had changed. Okay, actually a lot had changed, but none of it had anything to do with the small platinum business card in my wallet that I was now legally required to keep on my person at all times. I was 32 now, still living in Vegas. However, I was no longer the lowly research assistant that had just hit the proverbial nerd jackpot. My status had since been upgraded to the cool young geology professor, after accepting the offer for an assistant professor position at my most recent alma mater. Also of note, my cramped one-bedroom apartment across from campus had since been upgraded to a one-bedroom house down the street, much to the enjoyment of my cats. It was official. I was moving up in the world. I taught mainly introductory geology and earth science classes as an assistant professor, with most of my free time being dedicated to taming the ever-growing to-do list of research projects and papers I had agreed to throw my name on. I've got to admit, while the research grind did get a bit tedious at times, I was consistently happy with my teaching responsibilities. Since accepting the position, I had realized that the only thing I enjoyed more than learning about rocks was teaching other people about them. While I had found that I could usually win over most of my students to the wonderful world of geology, there were always a few holdouts I could never hope to convert. Actually, on my very first day of teaching a few years ago, the very first question I received upon the conclusion of my very first lecture as a college professor was an ever so casual, "So how do you relate this all to creation?" delivered by a young woman sitting at the front of the class. The question had very visibly caught me off guard, so I followed up by asking the student for some clarification. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Could you elaborate a bit?" I said with an eyebrow firmly raised to its limit. "You know, creation. How do you relate this to the Bible?" she said, as if she wasn't baiting me into a geologist's favorite debate. I had obviously expected some difficult questions from my students, but this was a different variety of challenge as a first-year college professor. One poorly placed anecdote to this student about the monolith to ignorance that was the creationism philosophy, and I'd be in the dean's office getting my ass chewed out in front of whatever smugly smiling parent indoctrinated them into the crap in the first place. All I'll say is that I tend to think on timescales a lot longer than 6,000 years, I said, as I felt the pulse of a previously unknown vein near my left temple. Apparently, I'd rolled a proverbial nat 20 on this speech check, as that response seemed to shut the whole thing down without further debate. While I'd received more than a few eyebrow-raising queries from students over the following years, this interaction consistently stood out in my memory as the most baffling and comical. As far as good days versus bad days as a teacher go, today was already shaping up to be a major contender for the top spot in the good day category. After months of planning and careful coordination, I found myself with a van full of my most recent crop of undergrads in my favorite place on earth. Only a short 2-hour drive from Las Vegas, Death Valley National Park served as a truly primo field trip location for the University Geology Club. Our small flock of rock enthusiasts had arrived at the park in the early morning, having left from campus in the wee early hours to make the most of our limited time in the geologic Holy Land, that is Death Valley. While we had already hit a lot of the major highlights, Badwater Basin, Mesquite Flats sand dunes, and Ubehebe Crater, just to name a few, we still had a lot of great stops on our itinerary for the following day. We had made camp in, what was in my opinion, the best campsite in the entirety of the seemingly endless national park. Warm Springs was a hike-in campsite, or drive-in campsite for those with a sweet off-road capable passenger van, in quite literally the middle of nowhere. It was admittedly a bit of a slog to get to, but over the course of taking now probably over 100 students here in recent years, this small oasis in the harsh California desert had consistently proven to be a highlight of the trip for everyone involved. After a quick review with the group on the significance of our previous stops and the highlights of tomorrow's itinerary, as well as a forced unanimous agreement that we'd all be packed and ready to leave by 8 a.m. sharp, we all retreated to our tents to end the day. Once inside my tent, I used my trusty rock hammer to triple-check my sleeping bag for rogue snakes. I could tolerate a wide assortment of garden-variety creepy crawlies, but I firmly drew the line at snakes, and not without reason. The faded scars of 2 small puncture wounds on my left ankle I'd gained as a child served as a constant reminder that snakes were not my friend. Once I was 110% sure my bag was reptile-free, I quickly drifted off to sleep. It was now about 5 a.m., and the sky had just begun to shine with that low, muted glow that told you the sun would soon be making its slow return to the horizon. While I would largely consider myself to be a night owl by nature, something about being in the field just turned me into a well and true morning person. It probably helped that this region offered some truly spectacular sunrises, and today I was going to watch the sunrise in style. While the campsite was completely off-grid, the Warm Springs site did actually offer access to a small, hot spring in which one could attempt to melt away their sorrows. Despite what the name might have you visualize, the laughably small spring was incredibly remote, proving difficult to locate for most visitors. Having stayed here many times in the past, I was already well acquainted with the location of the elusive spring, and I had woken up on a mission to start my day with a hot soak. The path to the hot spring, if you could even call it that, was a winding track of sand and other unconsolidated material, slowly creeping up the face of a large terrace of Jurassic-age sandstones. As a policy, I generally discouraged my students from making this hike, as it was a precarious journey, to say the least. In the dozens or so times I made the hike myself, I had nearly fallen down the side of the mountain more times than I cared to admit. After carefully moving myself up the path at a snail's pace, I finally arrived at the top of the terrace, where I could see the nearby natural jacuzzi that was the final destination of my pilgrimage. A rock on the ground in front of me caught my eye. The roughly dinner plate-sized sheet of stone before me appeared to bear a consistent series of small indentations along its surface. It was in that moment that the synapses of my brain made the connection. They were footprints, and not just from any foot. From a distance, each impression on the rock appeared to show 3 distinct grooves, which could easily have been the toes of any small bipedal reptile. I excitedly reached down to collect the prized specimen I'd so luckily stumbled upon, where upon lifting it, I found that the rock already had an owner. A small tan snake was awoken by the commotion I'd caused by attempting to steal its home to add to my rock collection. My brain went into full-on monkey mode, as I shrieked and began to backpedal as quickly as I could in the opposite direction to the vile beast, staring me down with its cold, black eyes. As I scurried backward, I felt my feet wrap up on each other like a broken slinky, and I braced for the coming impact with the ground. When what felt like an eternity of time had passed, and the moment of impact had still yet to come, I realized my mistake. I had inadvertently thrown myself off the edge of the cliff, and my body was now sailing down to the ground roughly 200 feet below at breakaway speeds. I hit the ground with a loud thump that reverberated throughout my entire body as I heard the crunching of my bones, shattering like glass. As the pain overtook me, I felt the warmth of a sunbeam strike my face. The world collapsed into darkness around me. Chapter 3. Sam, version 2.0. I awoke with the sudden jolt one experiences after waking up during a dream of falling into an endless void. "Okay, what the fuck was that?" I said frantically, pawing at my arms, legs, neck, and face, checking for damage. Upon the quick confirmation that I hadn't just fallen apart like Humpty Dumpty, I noticed I was wearing an unfamiliar pair of white shirt and pants, similar to a set of medical scrubs. I looked up to take in my surroundings. I shit you not. It appeared as though the architect of this room had tracked down every stock photo of a waiting room on the internet, and just gone from there. It was a remarkably unremarkable space. I found myself sitting in the middle of a dozen or so basic cushioned chairs, facing directly toward a white, nondescript door in the center of the room. Upon closer examination, I realized the door was slightly ajar, and like clockwork, the door was slowly opened by the occupant inside. Not so slowly that it would elicit comparison to the creaky door of a murder mansion in a bad B horror movie, but more so in a way that was seemingly trying to project a sense of calm into the room. I was greeted by a slender young woman with long brunette hair, sporting a lab coat and what looked to be a tablet device of some kind, as she slowly stepped out of the doorway. "Dr. Scott?" she asked after looking up from her tablet to find me. "Yes," I said, momentarily unsure about the validity of my statement. "Excellent," she said while fiddling with her tablet. "You can follow me right this way," she said, turning around to make a quick retreat to what I now could see was an office space of some kind. So far, this experience was throwing off some major uncanny valley vibes, as my students would have so succinctly put it. But with no clear alternative, I stood up to follow her into the room. Upon standing up, I noted how good my body felt. No back pain, no neck pain, no aches or discomfort of any type. My memories prior to waking up in this room were a blur. I remember leading the field trip, hiking to the hot spring, finding an awesome set of dinosaur footprints to add to my collection, and proceeding to hurl myself off the side of a mountain like a rag doll, in avoidance of what was probably a non-venomous snake. After that, the memories only appeared in flashes, likely due to my brain compensating for the pain by turning itself on and off. I vaguely remember a helicopter, a hospital, and the muffled crying of what sounded like some of my students. The last thing I remember was the ceiling of a hospital room and the disembodied voices of several people I didn't recognize, all seemingly arguing over rights to my still warm body. Had the cryopreservation process really worked? Had they actually managed to thaw me out and patch me up, just as the Cryo Eterna employees had tried so hard to convince me? I wasn't gaining any new information by just standing around, so I moved to join my greeter in the room she'd so politely invited me into. In a similar fashion to the waiting room, the office space appeared as stereotypical as possible. The small space hosted a few shelves of unmarked books, a basic white desk, at which the room's occupant was now seated, and a small window on the wall behind the woman covered by some fairly standard-looking window blinds. The space also appeared to be incredibly well kept. As someone who's occupied their fair share of office spaces in my career as an academic, the only time I'd ever had an office this clean was on the day the geology department finally moved into a new building. The only noteworthy thing about the room was the presence of a large, and admittedly mysterious, cube-shaped device sitting neatly on the desktop. "So, what's with the cube?" I said nonchalantly, the first thought in my head coming straight out of my mouth in typical ADD fashion. While she was seemingly trying to hide it, the question had appeared to catch the young woman off guard. "That's not really important right now, Sam," she said while gesturing for me to sit down. "Just take a seat and let's start from the beginning." I sat down at one of the two seats in front of the desk and matched my gaze to that of the desk's owner. "So, what's the last thing you remember?" she said with a distinctly clerical tone that confirmed my belief that this routine was one in which my interviewer was well versed. I described my final moments to her as I had recalled them seconds earlier. She continued to mess with the tablet now sitting upright on the desk, seemingly checking something off a list with each recalled fragment of time I offered up. I was definitely being evaluated, but given what I thought was going on right now, that was to be expected. A sort of quality assurance check on the brains of the recently unthawed. "So how am I here right now?" I said, trying to remain calm. "In fact, where is here? And when is now?" I said, now failing to conceal my internal panic. "Whoa there. Calm down, Sam. One thing at a time," she said like a teacher trying to fend off a student playing 20 questions. "I promise I'm going to explain everything. For now, let's start with the when, work our way through the how, and circle back around to the where, and the why, all right?" Her response had offered little in terms of answers, but it was reassuring nonetheless. I gave her a head nod, and the still unnamed figure began her introduction. "As you'll recall, you had subscribed to the services of Cryo Eterna LLC for the cryopreservation of your remains upon your untimely demise. Does that ring a bell?" she asked while reading from her tablet. "Yes, I do recall that," I said, while restraining myself from arguing over the semantics of who had and had not technically subscribed to the aforementioned services. "Okay, great," she said with an ever-so-slight grin on her face. "Firstly, my name is Nira, and let me be the first to welcome you to the 22nd century," she said in a manner far too casual for the gravity of the statement, at least from my perspective. "Today is August 20th, 2177. In other words, the first day of the rest of your existence," said Nira, now unable to conceal her excitement. Her careful use of the word existence in lieu of the obvious choice of life couldn't help but strike me the wrong way. Was I not alive? I think, therefore I am, right? I was definitely thinking I could seemingly interact with the environment, and a third party had confirmed my existence. In that moment, I consigned myself to stick to the belief I was in fact alive. The young woman continued with her explanation. Following a series of increasingly dramatic events in the 2020s and 30s, your contract with Cryo Eterna and any rights you held as the remains of a potentially revivable person were rendered null and void following the country's brief takeover by an overtly religious political regime called the Free American Independent Theocratic Hegemony, more widely known as FAITH, she said, sounding slightly less chipper. Let me go ahead and reassure you, I am not a member of FAITH. In fact, no one is. Not really. Not anymore, she said, trying her best to present herself as friend and not foe. I'm actually a remote mission specialist with the Eurasia Space Control Center, a publicly funded space agency similar to NASA and part of the United States of Eurasia. So let me get this straight. I died back in Death Valley. My body was frozen, stored, and stolen by priests. And then it was stolen back by a space agency who decided to wake me up? I asked, trying not to sound like a complete smartass. Something like that, Sam, she said in an exasperated tone. But your version of the story is still missing a few key details, some of which you may potentially find difficult to accept. Just lay it on me, I said, tired of the continual tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. All right, here we go, she said, obviously finding it difficult to formulate her next statement. When Faith took ownership of your remains and the remains of thousands of others, they declared them an affront to God and sold them off to the highest bidders, many of which were private companies working in the commercial application of AI and robotics. You see, after finding basic machine intelligences unable to effectively operate some of the more complex services they offered to the public, they opted for a different approach to the problem. A group of researchers developed a method of precisely scanning the synaptic structure of the brain and also created a specially designed digital storage medium capable of supporting an active real-time simulation of that scan. The procedure was admittedly an incredible leap in mankind's understanding of the brain and consciousness, but it came at a real cost, she said in a low tone. Oh shit, I said, now sufficiently sure that the platinum package had lost any and all sense of value it once held. She continued, showing signs of genuine frustration. She was obviously not a fan of this story's ending, and I was starting to think I wouldn't be either. Oh shit, indeed, she said. I'm sorry to say that with no regard for the final wishes of their subjects, these groups took the remains and essentially downloaded the consciousnesses of hundreds of individuals like yourself in an irreversible and destructive scanning process, all for later use in commercial and government automation projects that needed a proverbial human touch, she said, her voice clearly projecting a homogeneous mixture of shame and remorse toward the situation. I felt sick but remained silent. What could I even say? That brings us back to this ominous little artifact you asked about earlier, she said casually, gesturing to the glowing blue cube sitting on the desk between us. And to this, she said in a much more cheerful tone. She quickly swiveled around in her seat and made a gesture I could only compare to a Jedi attempting to convince someone that these are not the droids you're looking for, toward the wall in front of me. In an instant, as if she'd just cast dispel illusion, the wall faded away from existence to reveal the world beyond it. The sun shined dimly through a cloudless sky, its weak light illuminating the distinctly red and rocky landscape I'd only ever seen in the high-resolution imagery of NASA's various satellites and rovers. She turned back to face me with a grin steadily growing between her cheeks. Dr. Scott, she said, seemingly pausing for dramatic effect. Welcome to Mars.